Well, welcome everyone. My name is Marina. I'm an assistant professor here at here at Old Dominion University, which is based in Norfolk, Virginia, and I'm also currently a president of the Hampton Roads chapter of American Society of Public Administration. And so I'm very excited for our two guest speakers joining us today to talk about government-nonprofit relations. And their organizations are both based in Washington, D.C. So we're bringing some kind of an interesting perspective from a different area. We usually invite regional speakers here, but we wanted to expand our reach a little bit. So I'm very excited for Mariana Martinez, the Chief Operational Officer of Familia, Vota, a nonprofit organization in the DC area, working to enhance the political voice of the Latino community across the country, to join us. And Carl Blake, an executive director for Paralyzed Veterans of America, with a national office in Washington, D.C., and nonprofit organization that was congressionally chartered as a veterans service organization advocating for veterans with spinal cord injury and disease, to join us as well. There is a lot more in your biographies, both of yours, that I'm not going to let you share, because you both sort of worked on both sides of kind of those relations, both in government and nonprofit sectors. And that's why I invited you, because I feel like you have so much more to share about kind of like seeing it from both sides, and just your many years of experience with nonprofit organizations and otherwise. So my first question kind of will probably touch on that, so you can like speak more to your experience. If you don't mind sharing your sort of career story, how you came to where you are, and how maybe that you saw that interaction between nonprofits and government at kind of at different points in time in your careers. So I'm going to start with Mariana.
Yes, well, thank you, Marina, for this invitation. I think it's so important to hear different perspectives and expose yourselves to as many perspectives as possible is important. So I'm very honored to share a little bit of my story and perhaps my views, which will help in you in life, hopefully. So again, my name is Mariana Martinez. I am based in Washington, D.C. I'm the COO for Mi Familia Vota. As you can imagine, after elections, we're exhausted, but we can say that there was a lot that happened in building Latino political power. But yes, so in my career, I essentially can say I'm Mexican-American French. So I do have 3 nationalities. That is possible. And no, I'm not a spy. So I speak different languages, and that's giving me the opportunity to, having lived in different countries, has given me the opportunity to understand different systems, different countries, different, et cetera, and obviously the way that they work. So I speak not only different languages in terms of languages, but I also speak different languages professionally. The very early part of my career, I was actually in the private sector. I used to manage properties in the hospitality business, which anybody, I would say, recommend to just professional development work in customer service. I will help you in so many ways. But I did that for a while. So until I couldn't do it anymore, right? I was like, I really wanted more in life. I wanted to align my values more to my career. So I actually decided to change careers and went back and pursued a master's degree in public administration. And that really was the launching of really being me and aligned with everything that I believed in. And since then, I dedicated to really making a difference in different, in different capacities. So I had the opportunity to work for the Ministry of Defense of France while I was in France, which was really interesting because it was an organization that kind of worked like the post office. You had to deliver as if it was a governmental institution, but perform as a private organization. So that was pretty good, a pretty good introduction to the public sector. And then I worked from there on, in nonprofit organizations, small, large and small, around diplomacy, civic engagement, et cetera, et cetera. And I also had the opportunity to work in philanthropic organizations. I worked for the top 20th largest foundation in the United States. It's called the Kresge Foundation, which was definitely an eye-opening because it was like the other side of working from nonprofits is asking for money. So it was interesting to see what the process and the thinking and the strategies around what it's like to actually give money and the strategies that go around, behind that. And then I also had the opportunity to work in government. I worked as a chief of staff for a council member, actually the first Latina ever elected in city council in the city of Detroit, Michigan. So that was fascinating. And to be honest, until this day, it was honestly one of my favorite jobs because it truly fulfilled me as a human being and giving everything that I could back into the community. And you could see really the changes in, policy or ordinances that we passed. You could see how it affected or how it benefited people immediately, almost sometimes. So that's a little bit of my path, and of course for me it's really, really important to continue doing so, and it's reflected in how I actually work for helping and moving my community to a place where they have a voice. So that's that. I think I'll pass it on to Carl.
Carl, share your story.
Thank you, Marina. Thank you, Mariana. So I'm Carl Blake. I'm the Executive Director of Paralyzed Veterans of America. As Marina said, we are a congressionally chartered veteran service organization based in Washington, D.C. I was originally commissioned as an officer in the United States Army back in 1998. I served several years in the Army and then was catastrophically injured in a training exercise. I was transferred to the Department of Veterans Affairs at their medical center in Richmond, Virginia. They also have a spinal cord injury center there, so I have a spinal cord injury, and I spent a year doing rehab there. And while I was there, I saw sort of the front line of delivery of services from a federal agency, that being the VA. I also was exposed to my organization, Paralyzed Veterans of America. And after I finished my rehab, a member of our organization said, "Hey, you should come to work for PVA. We're always looking for veterans with your experience and who are actual members of the organization." So I started work for PVA 20 years ago. I started in our Congressional Affairs and Government Relations Department, and I worked most of my career in congressional affairs. So I spent much of my career working on Capitol Hill with members of Congress, working with federal agencies, most notably the VA, but I've also worked with the Department of Transportation, Small Business Administration, and a number of others, all agencies that serve our members. So the members of my organization are veterans with spinal cord injury or disease like ALS or MS. And so any agencies that cross the paths of services that our members rely on or that they seek out from the government, I've worked in those spaces. And then about 5 years ago, I took on this role as the executive director as we're going through some leadership change in the organization. And I have stayed committed to this organization over all that time. I look at it as this organization gave me an opportunity to get involved after a relatively short career in the Army, and in many ways helped me kind of get back to life once it was time for me to become an active member of society again. And so I've stayed committed to the organization over all that time. And so that's just a short version.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your career stories. So based on that, what was your experience of sort of the relationships between the government and nonprofit? And I know in different points in time, you were on one side or one or the other side, but how would you describe it? Was it mostly effective, mostly productive? Have you noticed any dysfunction that probably could have been improved and corrected? And Carl, let's start with you now.
Okay, so the first thing I would say is, the veterans community and its relationship with federal agencies is a little bit unique, I would say, because of just the nature of the population being served and the relationships that have been built over a long history with many of these agencies. The veterans community is the clearest example of, I think, in nonprofit courses, you learn about the iron triangle, and Mariana sort of framed her roles in serving in different aspects, whether in the government or in the nonprofit sector. The veterans community is like the clearest example of it because you have the federal agency, VA, the Congress, and nonprofit organizations like PVA that all work in tandem. I would tell you that it has proven to be effective over the years. The veterans are well taken care of generally by the government. You hear a lot of things on the news about where they're not being served, and I would tell you that some of that you have to take with a grain of salt. A lot of it comes from the advocacy and service work done by organizations like my own. I think the nature of the relationship varies, I think, depending on what the outcome is. So there's some of the work that goes on the federal agency side that creates a little bit of an adversarial tension between the nonprofit organizations and and the federal government. And of course, you know, if we're talking about Congress, I could make the argument that there's always an adversarial relationship. Having spent 15 of my 20 years working with Capitol Hill, I would tell you that the thing that I have seen that changed the most in my time is when I first started at PVA, I could make the argument that there were still some things that I would consider like sacred cows, things that were bipartisan or even nonpartisan. Veterans was one of them. And the thing that I think I've seen change most fundamentally over the last 20 years is nothing is sacred anymore. I hate to say that, but I think everything is influenced by more partisan politics. And that bleeds over into the federal agencies that we work with. And so it just creates more tension and complication in trying to ultimately deliver services to the people that we're trying to serve. You know, we still maintain good relationships in certain areas where there's overlap in the services that we provide and the partnerships that we have with certain agencies, but the relationships have become more complicated over time. And I hate to blame politics for that, but I would certainly say that has had a significant impact on why those relationships have changed. I don't know if that answered the question or not, but
I think you touched on a very important thing because, things are changing over time. And I think it's important to acknowledge, or at least kind of, think about like, well, what has changed and how we can kind of not necessarily go back to where we were, to what we were, but how can we improve and repair some of the relationships that maybe like suffered as a result of partisanship. Mariana, go ahead. Jump in on this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the polarization that we're seeing in our country is unlike we've ever seen before. And it's sad, but something definitely that needs to be worked on and has affected, obviously has had ramifications everywhere, right? So I'm going to go back to the basics. We're human beings, so partnerships is the most important. Like being able to collaborate is, to me, the foundation in any sector, whether it's private, public, government, philanthropy. I cannot emphasize it enough. Working in silos will not get you anywhere. So yes, being able to agree to disagree is something that's very, very important. And I can provide different examples around that. But even going to back our primitive beginnings, like we as a race or as a human, as humans survived because we were in tribes, right? Like we are not alone. Working in silos will never get you to advance. So I think from the different places where I worked, municipal government, obviously being able to work with nonprofits, serving filling the blanks that the government is not serving, and nonprofits do it. So being able to partner with those organizations made being able to serve people better. Philanthropy, right? Like you can have millions of dollars, but if you're not the one executing, right? Like if you don't give the money to the organ and have good partnerships with the people doing the work and making that happen, what good organization are you? If you're just coming in, right, colonizing, maybe that's a strong word, and saying this is what I see, but if you're not partnering with the communities that you're helping, your money is not going to go far. And then nonprofits, right? Nonprofits is important to understand who is doing the work that you're doing, right? Like if I serve the Latino community, like who else is serving the Latino community, and to what extent, right? We're all going to have strategies and goals and objectives, but you don't want to be double doing the same thing, right? And if you are doing it, which could happen, in what ways can we complement each other, right? Like in what ways can we work together in partnership to better serve the communities that you're trying to serve? Working in silos, and I've seen people, organizations, and call it private sector, right? Like the properties that I saw thrive the most were the ones who talk to each other, who, there's something called yield management, which is just like the forecasting of your prices, right? Like talking to each other help you as an organization to make more money. So I think no matter how you look at it, partnerships are fundamental. Being able to agree to disagree is fundamental in understanding and, in your ability to do the work that you're doing wherever you are. One example that I can think of where it was just really like touched me personally, and I've been able to take it everywhere I go, is in city council, right? City council members, sometimes they had different views and fundamental different views about certain things, but being able to build a relationship with them, right? Me as a chief of staff with their chief of staffs respectively, and my boss with, right, other council members, having that relationship and seeing people as who they are as people and have some certain connection made it easier to disagree, which is not something we're seeing happening in government right now, right? But having that relationship helped in, okay, I respect you and I see you as a human being. Then it's going to be easier to then disagree with you as a person versus I don't know who you are and I see you, and there's that narrative, you versus us. It's going to get you nowhere, right? Obviously, I have my views and I'm not willing to change or compromise. It's just not helping. So I think for me, I guess the most important message is partnerships and not working in silos. Wherever you are, ensure that you're connecting with the people that you're working, the organizations that are doing similar work that you're doing, that you're partnering, right? Like, well, how can we complement the work? And sometimes that does require a little bit of tweaking.
For future
I'm sorry. And sometimes that may require a little bit of pivoting the work, of not necessarily pivoting, but incorporating into your strategies. How do I, right? Like, what's my theory of change, right? To ensure that I'm not the only one, or I don't have, my vision includes those who are doing the work that I want to see accomplished. So,
Marina, I would also add, Mariana made some great points there about not being siloed and working to collaborate. I think in my experience, people inherently want to help other people. That's not always, that's not a universal concept, but what that turns into is ideas that become organizations with a goal or a mission to accomplish something to benefit people. And what has happened over the years is you end up with organizations, everyone has a unique idea, and yet there are a lot of ideas that are the same. So the key is, how do you bring those groups together to maximize their effort without duplicating effort? Because the truth is, in the nonprofit sector, the competition for resources is always ongoing. And so you have to figure out, how can we leverage what is available out there so that I can accomplish my mission and my partners can do the same. And at the same time, how do we either supplement or maybe completely fulfill a mission that an agency cannot fulfill? How do we deliver on those expectations in a complex environment, in a competitive environment? I think, many organizations struggle with the idea of partnering with other nonprofits because there's always this inherent fear of being swallowed up by a more powerful player or losing your identity. And, in my own community, we deal with that all the time, but, we try to work together as community partners to make sure that we're meeting our individual members' needs, and then there's a collective, and how do we maximize that effort? And I think that in many ways tries to set up a case where you're not having the silo issues that Mariana mentioned. They're inevitable, they happen anyway. But I think that the key is to bring the folks together so that they can, I think you can accomplish more through the collaborative nature of the work that Mariana mentioned.
And if I just want to say something really quickly on that, you said something really important, working in nonprofits, right? Like you have been, you are, maybe, I don't know, an executive director, you will have to compete, right? Like, I think that's real. It's a real talk, is for resources. But I do think that parting from a place of scarcity will lead you to scarcity. So I think it's in the collaboration, and every single nonprofit has something unique. So as long as if you're confident, right, like bring confidence into what my organization is complementing and ensuring, right? And that's why it's important to understand what other nonprofits are doing, because you are doing something unique that will call in for different funding. So I think oftentimes we fall into working in silos because we part from that mentality of scarcity. Like, okay, I'm competing. Yes, you are, but at the same time, you're also unique. So just leading with that will help you get more resources.
Yes, no, absolutely. I think you both are sort of kind of talking about in the nonprofit world. I mean, collaboration and partnerships are very important, almost for survival purposes. But both of you were also mentioned your advocacy efforts within your organizations that you're doing. And we kind of know, I guess, that sometimes that advocacy can put you against some kind of, government political interests, right? It's not always necessarily seen as not necessarily as a positive thing, but it can be kind of like what Carl, you mentioned, can be taken as a little adversarial, because you kind of asking almost for a change in maybe policies, kind of change it in the status quo, right? So I'm wondering, in your experience, kind of advocating to the government maybe for some changes, has that ever backfired, or sort of kind of severed the relationships at all, or it was actually a positive thing that led to some good changes? if whoever wants to go first.
I'll jump in. So, much of the work that we do in our community is advocacy based. As I mentioned, I spent most of my career working with members of the United States Congress. And my view has always been, if you stand on what you believe in, you're not always going to win at what you're advocating for, but you still have to stand on your principles. As a member serving organization, our focus is always on creating the best opportunity, maximizing the benefit opportunity, advocating for what the needs of our members are, and making sure that public policy is directed in such a fashion as to best serve them. Certainly, you don't always win. In 15 years in working on Capitol Hill, I can probably count on the fingers of my two hands the number of real policy victories that have meaningful impact. There's always little victories, and those are important too. But big policy change, frankly, big policy change does not happen that frequently, and sometimes it goes completely against what you believe in or what you're trying to advocate for, and you can't be afraid to lose in that fight. The key is to never give it up, because you're always trying to push forward to make that change that's necessary. And politics is cyclical, so while you might find stiff headwinds this go around, the next time, the next cycle, the wind may be at your back, and you may have an opportunity to make change. I go back to what I said earlier about the partisan nature of the Hill. What people don't realize is there are still a lot of good that gets done, even in what, despite what you see on the news or read about in the paper, if people read the paper anymore. What you read about, a lot of good still gets done in a lot of different areas to benefit a lot of different people. There are big policy items that are always out there that are sort of the whipping boy of discussion, but you just have to stick to your guns and don't give up your fight. There are issues that we've worked on almost since our existence, and that's 75 years, and you're always trying to make incremental progress.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think that keeping the end goal in mind is really important, because sometimes moving the needle I wouldn't call it a failure, right? Like, you advocated for something, it didn't work out or something. I wouldn't necessarily call it a failure. I would call it as a learning lesson of what was it, as long as you continue evaluating how you did it, why you did it, and what worked well and what didn't work well, to then make adjustments for your next then it's not a failure. I think failures is just their lessons to, like, what is it that I could do better? And yeah, it's admitting that, or maybe I didn't include this it wasn't inclusive, or it wasn't, clear, or didn't communicate, or I didn't, whatever it is. I think it's really important to continue having that self-reflection of how you function as an organization, and what your leadership is and how you're being perceived in the community. I think that's important. So I wouldn't say, like, necessarily if something didn't go, or an advocacy that you were doing didn't necessarily go your way, it's a failure. Having the end goal in mind, again, like I mentioned, is really important, because maybe this is not, we didn't win here, but in the larger picture, we are moving the needle, right? And to move the needle significantly takes time. It's not a year. It's not, sometimes it's a 5-10-year goal, and just keeping that in mind, that you're moving toward the right direction, then you're in the right path, right? So I think that's why it's important to invest in your strategies and in your goals, right? If you don't know where you're going, you'll end up somewhere. So be clear with where you're going as an organization. That will help in understanding the larger picture of, gains and losses, if you will.
And
then sometimes,
sorry, go ahead, Mariana.
No, sorry, I was gonna say, in yielding, sometimes it's important to yield. Like, okay, I advocate for something, but maybe it wasn't for me to advocate for something, or maybe it wasn't my place. And I have a really good example about that. There was, during the pandemic, there was obviously services, right? Like, it was disproportionately affecting people of color, and seeing that was just really frustrating, right? In Detroit was like, just people were dying left and right. And we were like, how do we do this, right? We had the opportunity to advocate for funding to come to the city, and specifically for undocumented immigrants, who were the ones who just were not able to receive any help or anything. And so, as a governmental entity, is like, well, how we need to help. There's still residents of our district. So we received funding to help, but we recognized that we weren't going to be able to, with all the red tape and the infrastructure that existed in the city, we weren't going to be able to spread it out to the communities as fast as it needed to. So yielding was really important to understand and recognize that nonprofits that have a lot more leverage and more flexibility were going to be able to help those communities. So we basically rerouted the conversation, yielded so that those funds went to a nonprofit, and then the funds were just distributed a lot faster than us. So again, recognizing your shortcomings is really, really important, that it's not always your place, even if you want to, for the specific challenge that you have at hand.
One thing I was going to add is, in the relationship between organizations and any federal, any government agency at whatever level, more often than not, the nonprofit organization is going to be the subject matter expert on a given issue, or they're going to have a better, clearer understanding of the constituent population being served. And so you can lean in on that in the relationship with the policymakers at any level. And if they, if you cultivate the relationship right, even if there's a difference of political opinion, they can't just dismiss out of hand. Some do, but most often they will not dismiss out of hand the expertise that you bring to the issue and the constituents being served. And so there's always the opportunity to improve public policy to benefit people, because if the nonprofit organizations didn't exist, frankly, the government agencies don't have the capacity to build the deeper knowledge and expertise that they have to have. And frankly, policymakers, in my experience, their understanding of issues tends to be superficial, only because the breadth of things that they have to focus on is so widespread that they can't get focused in on one particular issue. Now they may. Policymakers almost always have like an issue that's their issue, and they'll understand that better than anything else. But the organizations bring to the table the clearer understanding, the deeper knowledge that can help inform, public policy on both the federal and local and state agency side, and in the policymakers that are the elected officials as well.
Oh God, and I have to say something there, because I haven't worked in politics directly. I do. Policy it's not drafted. And if it is drafted behind a castle, not connected to the community, then it's not a policy, or it's not, they're not going to be changes that are going to benefit our communities. The people who are on the ground are the ones who understand. So politicians, elected officials need to work with most, community leaders and nonprofit organizations, because those are the ones on the ground understanding the issues that we're trying to solve. So in that sense, that partnership, or because I often, as an office, a lot of people wanted to work, I want to just draft policy. I'm like, yeah, but have you worked in community? No. I'm like, well, then how are you? Where's the connection? Like, understanding just policy alone is not going to get you. Have to fundamentally understand what the needs of the community are. And how do you do that? By being out there, right? And nonprofits are the ones doing that. So very important point.
I recall in the sort of the closing courses of the nonprofit track at ODU. It's been a couple years, but it hadn't been that long ago. There was an entire series of case studies on the environment around the Norfolk area, the watersheds from the various rivers, the Chesapeake Bay, and probably was not a clearer example of how local organizations affected change in the greater environment, from the rivers and the bay, and how that changed the communities around them. Like there were some great examples of how different organizations in the different communities around the larger Norfolk and Portsmouth and Chesapeake area made change that benefited the greater good, and even local governments reaped benefits from it. So it's that's how things should work. They don't always work that way, but it's amazing what you can do when you create that type of an environment between the organizations and agencies and policymakers all together.
Thank you for that example. We actually have a couple people in the audience who can absolutely relate to exactly what you were saying. And I think this is also a good moment for me to remind the audience that please feel free to ask questions as we go along. You can raise your hand and put the question in the chat, so we can have a lot more interaction. But no, I absolutely agree. And the whole conversation about the advocacy and nonprofits kind of also made me think about, again, our classroom discussions, how a lot of nonprofits kind of shy away from advocacy efforts, even if it's not like the core of their mission, just because they feel like interfering they're kind of almost afraid of sort of the potential retaliation that they can get from the government because they're, say, receiving funding from the government, and they just don't want to, again, somehow don't want their relationships to be affected by their maybe activism and like kind of active stance on certain not political, but policy issues. So that I think both of you kind of reinforce that notion that advocacy actually is important. You have to speak out because you are the ones that usually know on the ground issues, and you can be that sort of that liaison of actually relaying the reality of the things and how policy can actually be drafted to affect it, right, Mariana?
Yeah, no, I was like, I feel like so compelled to say it. I almost cut you off. I'm sorry. Bad habit, bad habit. No, I absolutely agree. And I think we have to demystify the word advocacy, because as working as a nonprofit, you have to advocate for your organization, whether it's to fundraise money, to explain what you're doing, to convince people to join your cause. Like, you need to advocate. So I think demystifying that word isn't like evil or like something we don't do. It's incorrect, right? Because it really is something you're going to do, and it's going to be one of the foundations of who you are and how you're going to be successful at what you do. Also, so the organization that I work for now is a C3 and C4. So as you know, C4 is political. It gives you a lot more leverage, and you're able to basically talk about candidates, et cetera, or about politics. And so having working in an organization like that made me realize to what extent you actually can really push the threshold, right? Like, or what C3 ends or where C4 really ends. So being aware, right? And talking to maybe pro bono attorneys, I will drop on the chat organizations that could potentially help you in understanding what is the line, to what extent I can say and advocate, right? Like calling for action, I believe, right? What is the threshold to say, to what point I can advocate? So, because you really do have, and we encourage you to do it. We need you to do it, right? Like, you are the ones spreading the message and doing the work. So yeah. Let's get really familiar and comfortable with those lines, because you really do have more leverage than you think.
Maybe it's slightly off topic, but what Mariana said there is so important in understanding what type of an organization nonprofit is. So PVA is purely a C3. So we have to really understand what our guardrails are in terms of what our limits for advocacy are. You know, we actually have registered lobbyists that are part of our government relations staff. Once upon a time, I was one of those folks. But we do a lot of training for our own internal purposes so that people know you can't go here. And where we run into issues sometimes is, you know, we have a lot of local leaders, we have chapters around the country, and they develop relationships with policymakers at every level, at the state and local level. And we tell them, you can be as close to them as you want, but don't be seen advocating for their election, because then the organization becomes affiliated with that type of sort of partisan activity. And those are lines that we can't cross. So it doesn't mean you can't advocate for clear policy changes. And sometimes it might feel like I'm taking a partisan position, because, you know, many policy issues have a right side and a left side in the argument. But we don't frame it in that way, so that we don't get pigeonholed into, oh, well, you're a Republican organization or a Democratic organization or whatever it may be. But we have to, in order to make sure we don't cross those boundaries, we have to do a lot of internal training so that our people know, look, if it looks like this is maybe inappropriate, just stay away from that, because you don't want to get yourself in trouble. Sometimes I'm jealous of organizations that are C4s. I have some partner organizations that are C9. They have flexibility to do things. And you know, the truth is, you know, many of our own staff, you know, we're a people-based organization. We all have our own individual views. And truthfully, the environment in the country has changed dramatically in the last few years. There's much more of sort of an activist nature among everyone. And so it's sometimes feels like you're holding back the wolves who want to attack on issues and helping them understand, look, it doesn't mean the organization doesn't support an issue, but that things have gotten much more complicated in the environment that we operate in. I mentioned earlier about how things have become more partisan. So how we navigate those waters becomes much more difficult. But Mariana's correct. I think people need to understand that if you don't advocate for some fashion, you know, I kind of group nonprofits into advocacy organizations and service delivery organizations. But even those that are delivering a specific service, if you don't advocate, you're going to eventually dry up, you're going to lose support, and it won't matter what service you want to provide because people either won't know about you or won't support you. So, advocacy is inherently part of what you're going to do as a nonprofit organization.
Yeah, and I just dropped in a link of Alliance for Justice. It's a really good organization that that actually supports nonprofits and understanding how to advocate or how to help you how to advocate. So definitely recommend utilizing services like that. But for sure, like focusing on the issue, I think it's important, right? Like you're not necessarily like how you frame it. Like if I'm serving this community and right there's ultimately what is going to benefit our community, you can definitely talk about like us. For example, in our C3 side, in advocating for our community, we can say these issues affect our community or benefit our community. And so you're not talking about politics, you're talking about whoever has that perspective, whoever supports that is definitely something you can do. So yeah, I recommend just getting comfortable on what are the lines that I can cross or what's the threshold, and then focusing on the issue that you're advocating for, because focusing on the issue takes away distills, right, or disentangles the politics around anything that you're trying to advocate for.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing your perspectives. I do have one question from the audience. It was sent to me in the chat. Can you describe both positives and negatives that impacted nonprofit organizations coming out of pandemic? And you can speak to either your exact organization or maybe just in the environment of nonprofit organizations in general, like in DC area or elsewhere. What were the positive and negative impacts of the pandemic on nonprofit organizations?
That's a big question. That's a loaded
question. So many
question.
different ways to answer that question,
Right.
because I could talk about the internal impact of how we operate and conduct our business. I could talk about how it influences our work on Capitol Hill and with agencies, because access obviously changed as a result of the
let's
pandemic.
start with that. Let's start with the relationships, because obviously you couldn't physically kind of go to the offices, right, and talk to people. How that changed?
Yeah, so from our experience, a lot of the work that we do is direct interaction with, particularly with VA, because that's our principal agency that we work with. And the pandemic, for all intents and purposes, shut down that access. And what it did was it created an environment where you didn't know what you didn't know, because things were always changing and now they're out of sight. And when you're there in person, this is a discussion that could also traffic over into people working in the office or working remotely. I mean, there are a lot of overlaps in some of these ideas, but the challenge was maintaining visibility on issues that we're always working on, understanding the changes that the agencies were making. A number of agencies fundamentally changed how they delivered their services, which impacted how we interacted with the veterans that we serve. We work one of the largest agencies in the federal government is the VA's healthcare system. And because that system got basically closed up completely, we lost a lot of visibility on what the VA was doing, how they were meeting the needs of veterans who needed support around the country. It was a complicated, and I don't know that we've gone back. We haven't. I think the frustration that we have now is that has become a reason for, and VA is just the clearest example I have, but in some of the other agencies that we've worked with, like small business, Office of Personnel Management, it's been challenging getting back in the door, because I think we're most effective when we're meeting with these folks and having a chance to sit down face to face. While this type of platform has become the most used medium that there is, it's not the same as sitting in a room. It's also, you lose visibility on the areas where we as a nonprofit are also an accountability mechanism for the federal agencies that we work with. And losing some visibility makes it a little bit harder for us to hold them accountable to what they're required to do, what we expect of them, and what our members who they serve expect of them as well.
Thank you.
And I would say, like Carl said, right, there's a lot of things that change for the good or for the bad, for the ugly. I don't know. There's definitely things that came out. I would say from the internal side, we realized that, right, like being a nonprofit and depending on what cause you're advocating, we realized that we could be more flexible, right? Like you can flexible in giving time in obviously, you don't need to be in the office, commuting and all of that I think applies to any sector was something that we realized you don't necessarily need to, that you can function really well in changing the way that you operate, right? So I think for me, it was really the pandemic. I lived it starting when I was in an office, right? So, well, I mean, not myself, I was an elected official, but I was working for a politician. So it was like providing that flexibility and ensuring that our staff didn't burn out was really important. So it allows us to rethink of how, right, like how we function. It forced us really to do it. And I don't think this is, again, particular to government or nonprofits, but that providing flexibility was really, really important. I think that has had really good benefits in the long run because we realized that's something you can do and we can still operate and function and exceed expectations in how we operate. That's the internal. And then I think externally, obviously the pandemic exacerbated a lot of the issues that already existed in the community. So being in office, right, like access to information was really hard already for certain communities like senior citizens or people who don't speak English or whose English is their second language, who are not necessarily connected in the same way or are not necessarily computer proficient, right, or don't necessarily have internet. So reaching those communities was hard. Well, it was even harder during the pandemic because there wasn't that in-person interaction that was happening. So I think something that the pandemic helped, being in government as well as nonprofits, helped us to see us to become innovative and come up with different kinds of solutions. How do we reach them? How do we, right? Like, how are we challenging ourselves to ensure that the information that they have access to the information that they need so that they can reach the resources that are available? So that was, in a way, helping us pivot our strategies, utilize maybe text phoning or texting, right? Like utilizing services that normally you wouldn't have was helpful. So again, pushing you out of your comfort zone. And then this is why I think it's really important to always be strategic at what your tactics are and how you want to deliver it, because it will help you, again, bring that uniqueness to the work that you're doing. So yeah, good and bad things. I think that we can talk about this for a long time, but I think those are some that I can think of.
Yeah, I would add, Mariana's last point there made me think, one of the lessons that we learned was how to be much more agile and adaptive to the environment. And I don't think most people, having worked primarily at the federal level, most federal agencies would not be classified as being particularly agile or dynamic in change when they need to deliver services. So we've all kind of had to learn on the fly. We really learned in a very short period of time how we could pivot to deliver our needs. We really had, from a nonprofit perspective, we had to really change how we deliver programs and services to the members that we serve, because they still have demands and needs. And while we have always had sort of the same way of doing business, we just couldn't do it that way during the principal part of the pandemic. And so, one of the things that we've figured out how to be much more inclusive, how to be much more adaptable, how to have multiple platforms to deliver the different types of things that we do to our members. And then to the internal point, I'm going to take a flip side point to Mariana's comment about, you can work more remotely. And that, I would say, like, the remote work question is the number one struggle that I have seen from an internal perspective. And the challenge is, I've personally had to adapt to being more open for our staff who want to work remotely. And I'm okay with that now, having seen how it works. I think the challenge, and this is true whether nonprofit or any type of organization, the challenge is we equally experienced a lot of burnout from our staff from the fully remote environment, because the challenge is people then lose some sense of work-life balance in that if they're working fully remotely, the work is always there. And so they have to understand, and we as an organization have to help them understand how to better balance when the work is always sitting in front of you because it's at home. You can burn out even faster. So it was a challenge in helping our staff and even amongst my own leadership team and myself, understanding what's the best way to navigate this, because if we burn out too many times too fast, then we all will just be ineffective, and it'll hurt the organization as a whole.
That's a great point. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, yeah, like you said, employees of any organization probably experienced it and had to sort of struggle with it or kind of try finding solutions. Gary has a question. Gary, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mariana. I appreciate it. Cara, Mariana, I just think this is a really outstanding discussion. One of the things of course, I'm interested in as someone who teaches nonprofit and this area of collaboration is the character and the emotional intelligence and the personality attributes that make someone successful in collaboration. So based upon your experience, we have, of course, students, who are actually either watching this now or will watch it later. What is your advice on some of the important character, personality, and emotional intelligence attributes that just make you successful in the nonprofit sector, especially when it comes to dealing with the complex process of collaboration?
Thank you, Gary. That's a really great question. I'm so happy you're talking about emotional intelligence, because I think that's not something that we discuss upon hiring, or that's even like a norm, right? Like when you're hiring, it's like, does that person fit the, right? Like, does this person have the experience? I think it's a more holistic way at looking at when you hire, like how does that person react to stress, right? Like what are the, what are the person's values, right? Do the person's values align with the organization's values? So I think it's the vetting and making sure that that person is fully aligned with the work that you're doing is really, really important. Emotional intelligence is not something that's commonly talked about, but it's probably the most important factor. I would even argue more than the intellectual. Emotional intelligence takes you, right? If you have higher emotional intelligence, it's people who are going to tolerate different personalities, who are going to be able to, better argue, right? Like have disagreements, etc. So I think figuring out how to measure emotional intelligence as you're hiring people, it's something, right, like that would be worth looking into and implementing into when you're hiring. Now, you don't always have the opportunity to just hire, right? As there's the people who are already your staff members. How do you invest in ensuring that they are also aligned? I think professional development is something that we often don't look, or it's under resourced, right? Because we're scrambling for resources to just operate. But I think investing in the organizations are made out of people. We are people. We are the ones. If you take care of your staff members, they will take care of you. And believe me, especially when they believe in the cause, more so than in the private sector, I think even unique to the private sector and government is people go and do that because they believe in the cause. So taking care of your staff members, fundamental. So ensuring like what are the, right, like I think surveys and unanimous surveys is really important to understand like what are the trends, what are the things that they need. Maybe oftentimes as leaders, we don't necessarily see what the issues are because people don't feel comfortable giving you feedback. So checking the temperature as to like what is working in my organization is really helpful to ensure that people are satisfied. And one of them, again, is professional development. So recognizing a path. Not everything is tied to money, right? So professional development doesn't necessarily mean you have to necessarily have a budget. There are a lot of opportunities, other organizations, foundations that provide opportunities to, nonprofits at essentially for free. So what are the resources and what are the skills that you want your team members to have, including emotional intelligence? So I think not forgetting that that's an important component to it. It's just leading with that. How do I take care of my staff members? How do I ensure that I'm preparing them with the resources and tools to do the work that I'm asking them to do is our jobs. And you should be leading with that, because you take care of your staff, they'll take care of your organization.
Yeah, I think what I would add is, at the leadership level, and this has been a challenge for our own organization because we're sort of old, set in our ways. The key for our leadership is to be open-minded. People are different. They have different views. Don't facilitate an adversarial relationship within the work environment. Be open-minded, listen to what people's views are, and understand that you're not always going to agree. That's just the way it is. We try to, at our senior leadership level in my organization, we make a lot of decisions collaboratively. Obviously the buck stops with me. I give the final yes or no on nearly all decisions. But almost never do I just unilaterally make a decision. I'm always bringing in all of the members of our leadership team and let them help inform the decision, so that ultimately if I make the decision, the team is going to say, you know what, that's the right decision to make, having had a chance to sort of look at it from all the different perspectives there are. The other challenge for organizations, and it's become much more acute in the last couple of years, is there's a lot of discussion about diversity and equity and inclusion in organizations. And, I know a lot of organizations that pay lip service to that. I could make an argument that years ago, long ago, my own organization was guilty of that because it's an old organization. But frankly, employees that are coming into the workforce and into nonprofits today want to see more than lip service. They want to see that you demonstrate through your actions, through the values that you espouse, and who you hire and what roles you place them in. They want to see that you're committed to those types of values. And I think ultimately it pays off in the long run, because then you bring in this diverse set of people with diverse views, and that better informs your decisions. So, I think the key is to, I come from a world being in the military and in the veterans community where it's always been sort of this hierarchical approach to doing things, and it doesn't have to be that way. The last thing I'd say, one of the things that has benefited our organization, I said we went through a significant leadership transition about 5 years ago, and one of the things we tried to adapt in that transition with a bunch of new leaders is to create more of a learning organization type environment where we're all, none of us has the right answer. None of us are immune to continuing to learn what's best for the organization, what's best for our members. And we try to filter that idea down across all aspects of the organization so that the organization is always evolving. Now, the pandemic probably expedited some of that learning, but frankly, I think that's for the betterment of the organization over the long haul.
Yeah, if I could add one thing, because I think I feel the urge to say is to define what leadership you want to lead. Like, what is the leadership in your organization? Define that, right? Like, is it a democratic? Is it autocratic? And like sometimes we have to take a hard look at how we make decisions, because the more democratic your organization is, the more people are going to, the more they're going to feel like they're part of the, like, who's that making decisions, right? Like, if I had the buy-in, if I had a saying in what somewhat, right, at a meaningful point of the organization, in the direction of the organization, it will just help in the buy-in and in the overall functioning and moving forward in the organization. So defining what kind of leadership you have and how you want to lead, not just your values, because I think sometimes, like Carl said, right, like their lip service, right? Yeah, let's just do higher, diversity, inclusion, but what does that mean, and how does that practice in our right, and in your organization is really important, and practicing it, because just hiring someone, a person of color, just because you needed diversity without having the infrastructure to support that, you're going to it's going to be more detrimental to the people you're hiring. So I think defining what kind of leadership, how do you make decisions, how democratic, who's at the table, the more inclusive in terms of not just obviously races, nationality, etc., but of thought, like who is at the table helping making those decisions, the more that you're inclusive, the more views you're going to have, and the more buy-in you will have in your organization to move forward.
I was going to say thank you very much. It's the research really shows that, especially at the leadership level, almost 1/2 to 2/3 of the variance in leadership success is emotional intelligence. So the soft skills are really hard. And so it's really a joy for me to hear both of you emphasize the importance of that to success in the nonprofit world. So again, thank you both for your service. Enjoyed it.
Thank you so much, Gary, for that wonderful question. We only have about 5 minutes left. So is there any one last minute question? I think we're going to take one more question if there are any in the audience. And if not, I'm actually going to ask this, Carl, what you just were talking about, kind of like all those different, how your organization had kind of changed and evolved over time because of things that societally have changed too. So my question for both of you is, kind of going forward, do you see any other trends that you think, trends in the society, in the world, that you think your organization will need to adapt to? Again, it doesn't have to be, it's not that you are doing it now, maybe you're thinking about it. Moving forward, are there any other changes that you foresee that will affect your organization? And what would those be?
The answer is yes. This world is ever changing. The only constant is change. So I think that accepting that is really, really important. To me, is the makeup of our country. The very makeup of our country is going to look very different by 2040. A minority is going to be the majority. So just that is you just let that sink in, because it's going to look different in how you serve the people that you serve, the resources that you'll need to reach, etc. So I think having that in mind and being able to pivot, right? Creating the infrastructure. And again, I cannot emphasize enough to lead with strategy. And it sounds like fancy pantsy, right? But it really is needed to say, like, why do I see myself? Where do I see, what are the fundamental problems that I want to solve? How do I see the organization in 5-10 years? Obviously, you have to have a pathway to get there, because I've seen organizations planning for the next 10 years. And then you're like, but their 1-year plan has nothing to do with their 15, 20. And you're like, wait, where is the connection? Right? So having that vision, obviously don't spend too much time in the 20-year, because then if you have to pivot, you have to leave that time or those resources and to be able to pivot for major events in the world, like the pandemic, right? But I think leading with strategy will help you define what are the small steps will look like, what is the bigger, and how do we fit in the ecosystem of work that we exist, right? So in the more diverse in the service and then the people that we're serving, what does that look like? And asking yourself those questions. Maybe you don't have the answer, but at least putting them under your radar will help you just start preparing better. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, I would add, change is inevitable. The irony of me saying that is my wife would tell you I'm the most change averse person she's ever met. I've worked for 2 organizations in my life. I've lived in the same house for 20 years. So, but the truth is the environment around us is always changing, and now it's changing more rapidly. So I think, and that will impact everything. So our business operations have to be much more adaptable and flexible. How we serve our members has to be more adaptable. The political environment that we operate in is always changing. The key is how to become more dynamic to adjust to those changes more quickly. Mariana mentioned something about the disconnect between having a 1-year plan and a 20-year plan. My organization just went through a formal 5-year strategic planning process that we actually approved about 6 months ago. And of course, the biggest challenge is just since we approved that plan, things have changed. And so how do we take that plan and make it adaptable over the 5-year window of opportunity that we mapped out? So it has clear metrics set up at different trigger points over the 5-year span of it. And yet next year, some of those things may be irrelevant. And so how does that plan become much more flexible and adaptable to that changing environment? And I think, that will be the challenge for nonprofit organizations. My experience, new organizations, when they come to life, they just inherently seem to be more flexible and more adaptable and more dynamic. Old, long-standing organizations are the ones that are the battleships at sea that don't turn around in a bathtub kind of thing. They just take time, and when you're dealing with, we didn't even talk about governance and those aspects that also influence your direction and your decision making. The key is going to be that we have to be ready for the next change that comes. The pandemic taught us to, at the outset of the pandemic, we had to shift immediately. And I think that was the first opportunity, maybe in a very long time, where most organizations realized, wow, the world changed overnight and we weren't ready for that. How can we be ready the next time? God forbid something like the pandemic happened again, but big changes do happen. How can we be ready to make a change more quickly when presented with that type of situation?
Yeah, one last thing said. It's already time. It's leading with strategy. And I guess I can't emphasize enough, making space to talk about your strategy. Strategy is a living and breathing document. Don't make assumptions. Oh, people know that this is what we do. No, a lot of the times the leaders know, it's in their heads, but not necessarily those doing the work. So never assume things but leading and making space about to talk about strategy throughout the year will help you pivot for changes that are not necessarily forecasted.
Thank you both so much. This was such a great conversation. I personally was just glad to see you both via Zoom, unfortunately, not in person, but thank you so much for sharing your perspectives and just kind of being so engaged and so passionate about what you do. It's always telling you see it, and it just makes you want to go and change the world for the better. So I appreciate you taking the time, and thank you to the audience for listening in and asking very great questions. I hope we'll stay in touch, and thank you both again so much.